If there ever is a settlement on Mars, I'm sure that one of the first things they'll open up is a coffee house.
It's one of the most complex beverages on Earth.
$2 for a cup of coffee. 1 cent goes to the coffee grower.
It's mountain grown.
Coffee is the second most valuable legal traded commodity on the face of the earth, after oil.
Preto pela cor do negro que deu toda essa riqueza para o seu patrão, né?
It's just this little seed and has this enormous political, social, and economic impact on human beings.
This is the epic story of a beverage that shares its birthplace with our earliest human ancestors. In this hour, we see how the mass marketing of cheap coffee impacts those who drink it and grow it, and why for millions of men, women, and children, the golden bean has always made a wicked brew. For over a century, coffee prices have been spiraling upward and downward in wild cycles of boom and bust. This has created extravagant wealth for some and needless misery for many. At the outset of the 21st century, a lack of international regulations has left the world awash in more coffee than we can consume, pushing the price of green beans to the lowest level ever. One of the countries most affected is the world's coffee giant, Brazil.
Since the coffee market was deregulated in the early 90s, many changes have occurred in the industry in Brazil. There was a period of great difficulty for Brazilian markets because we would have very low prices like we are having now. Brazilian farmers fought harder to adapt, to produce in a more competitive way, reducing their costs.
Coffee production has gone industrial in Brazil, with cheap beans grown in huge volume. Specialists like George Howell are trying to boost prices by finding a better quality Brazilian coffee, which will command a higher price from the roasters. The search is on at the Cup of Excellence.
Cup of Excellence grew out of a project that I had been hired for by the United Nations to help producers make a higher quality product and then to sell it for higher prices.
Number one, 90 and up.
Yeah, baby.
The idea here is to develop relationships between consumers and producers. The producer gets the full result by getting the full price of the internet auction, which really gets extraordinary prices for these lots.
Tastes like turtles, the peanut caramel turtles, you know? I got that over and over.
The experts become more serious as they get close to making their pick. One of this year's finalists is on the verge of losing his farm because of the low market price. Coffee is worth its weight in gold, at least for the winning beans in the winning cup. The Cup of Excellence benefits consumers who have come to take for granted a good cup of coffee at a reasonable price. But if the crisis continues, they will taste the difference, as low prices force producers to cut corners or abandon their farms. And while corporate roasters buying coffee benefit from low prices, the people dependent on growing coffee suffer the pain. Over 2 centuries earlier, coffee hasn't arrived yet in the British colonies. In 1773, tea and ale are the beverages of choice. Ironically, the story of coffee begins when the British put a tax on tea.
The colonists didn't much like the idea of this tax, and they decided to show their displeasure. A local business person and brewer, Samuel Adams, got a whole bunch of Sons of Liberty together. They boarded a British merchantman, dumped all the tea in Boston Harbor. It was a signal that the days of being colonies under Britain were ended, and the signal of which side you were on in the struggle was the difference between walking into a tavern and ordering coffee or walking into the coffee house and ordering tea.
One of the Sons of Liberty is an avid tea drinker and future president, John Adams. He writes to his wife about kicking his tea habit. Tea must be universally renounced, and I must be weaned. The sooner, the better. From this time on, it becomes a patriotic duty to avoid tea. And since coffee is being cultivated nearer to home, it's also cheaper and more accessible. Coffee's illicit entry into Brazil begins as a border dispute and ends as an affair of romantic espionage.
French and Dutch Guiana were arguing over their border, and they couldn't get along about it. So they asked an official from Brazil, sort of an outsider, to come up and adjudicate, and his name was Francisco Paleta. He fell in love with the wife of the governor of French Guiana, and they began to have a passionate affair in between negotiations. And when he left, she gave him a bouquet of flowers, and as a token of her esteem, she put some fertile coffee berries in the middle of the bouquet. So he took those back to Brazil, and that's how coffee got to Brazil. And again, this was a major thing because no one was allowed to export the fertile beans. And then Brazil, of course, became the powerhouse of world coffee, which it remains to this day.
Você não consegue contar a história do Brasil sem contar a história do café. No início da colonização brasileira, você teve vários ciclos, o ciclo do pau-brasil, o ciclo da cana-do-açúcar, mas nada foi tão sólido como a cafeicultura no Brasil. O café determinou o povo brasileiro.
Do ponto de vista econômico, essa acumulação, então, vai permitir, vai exigir, vai permitir, vai incentivar todo um processo de melhoria de infraestrutura, de modernização, ferrovias, portos, sistema bancário, estrutura urbana.
Coffee creates modern Brazil, but at an enormous environmental cost.
Brazil had been a beautiful, self-sustaining place, lovely rainforests, very fecund land, no problem growing everything you needed. But then they began to cut down all the rainforests. They would burn them.
Se nós pensarmos que do que nós tínhamos, me parece que da Mata Atlântica, hoje em São Paulo, do que resta de massa nativa em São Paulo, hoje nós teríamos apenas 10%, por volta de 10%, se não me engano, E se nós olhássemos o mapa de São Paulo, sabendo que o café vai dominar toda a região.
Brazil's agricultural methods have routinely emphasized quantity over quality. When the land is depleted, planters simply abandon their farms and clear new swaths of forest. If the environmental cost is great, the human cost is even more devastating. As Americans grow fond of coffee, plantation owners bring in slaves by the shipful to do the intensive work of coffee cultivation.
Os escravos eles eram amontoados ali nos porões do navio como animais. E ali eles faziam as suas necessidades, tá? Eles tinham uma ração diária por dia, que muitas das vezes se resumia em fubá molhado para comer. E as condições desumanas pioravam mais ainda quando eles chegavam aqui no Brasil. Que já teve uma época que meu pai me disse que um escravo valia o preço de 16 bois.
A manutenção do escravismo 19, sem dúvida, vai permitir. Quanto mais o café ganhava espaço comercial, mais se fazia necessário trazer escravos.
Até nas próprias cantigas, nos próprios lamentos, que já vem de muitos anos, se fala muito nisso. O café vermelho da cor do sangue do negro e preto pela cor do negro, que deu toda essa riqueza para o seu patrão, né?
By 1816, there are over 1.5 million slaves in Brazil, a third of the population. More than half are working on coffee plantations.
O trabalho dos escravos, eles acordavam quando o dia estava amanhecendo ainda, trabalhavam o dia inteiro e só voltavam mesmo para a senzala e só quando estava anoitecendo, né? Era horas a fio de trabalho, com direito a comer uma vez só e o trabalho era muito pesado, muito pesado.
Forma a relação, digamos, senhorial, esses homens que se enriquecem com o café, dessas elites de que eu falei, que se enriquecem no café no século XIX. E no período imperial vão estar obtendo do imperador títulos de nobiliarquia, né? São chamados barões do café.
The plantation owners developed these gigantic fazendas with baronial houses, servants. They developed an incredibly privileged lifestyle, where they also felt privileged that they could go ahead and have sex with any of the slaves that they wanted, and if anybody objected, they could kill them. They were their own sort of mini-government, and they were the dictator.
E havia um sistema de controle bastante rígido, como se pode ver ainda pelo que restam de senzalas, de aparelhos de tortura nesse período.
Os barões do café, eles só tinham um olhar numa direção, era a mão de obra do negro de graça, que não precisava pagar nada. O preço, a qualquer preço eles queriam se enriquecer. Então para eles não existia mais nada a não ser riqueza, a não ser o dinheiro do café, né, que era o ouro da época, o café. Então para eles o que interessava era isso, o resto era o resto.
Their pockets brimming with golden beans, the coffee barons hold on to their slaves as long as they can, making Brazil the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery. But they keep their grip on the market for coffee, which is quickly becoming a staple of American life.
Green grass for my pony, a fire burning bright, and a pot of fresh coffee just to cheer the long night.
In most of North America during the early 19th century, everybody roasted their own beans, which sounds nice, and in a way it was. At least it was fresh roasted. But mostly what people would do would be to put the beans in their frying pan and then sort of stir them around on top of a wood stove. And they would get burned on the outside, they would be raw on the inside, and it would be pretty terrible coffee. And then they would grind them with a little hand grinder, and they would brew it by boiling it for like a half an hour or just leaving it on the stove all day long. Particularly cowboys prided themselves on their really strong coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe is their phrase. You really want good, strong coffee. And because they put the grounds right in there, they wanted something to clarify the coffee, to make the grounds go to the bottom. And so they would put either dried fish skin in, which does that job, or they would throw in eggshells, which also will make the grounds go to the bottom. So it's fairly disgusting stuff.
For workers of the Industrial Revolution, a cup of coffee isn't about taste, but about keeping alert in the new steam-powered factories. With Brazil producing lots of cheap coffee, Americans can afford to drink it. All they need is someone to roast the beans.
Before the Civil War, nobody had invented a really good industrial roaster, so they had the huge furnace, and it was sort of like a scene from Dante's Inferno. It was hot and smelly and awful and difficult. Finally, a guy named Jabez Burns invented a self-emptying roaster, a very clever device where it had a little screw inside, and all you did was open the front, and it would dump the beans out. And that revolutionized the coffee business.
The second thing that happened was a fellow in Brooklyn, New York, invented the paper bag. It was what we now call a craft paper bag. Those little brown bags, and he had them printed with the face of an elephant on the front for selling peanuts.
John Arbuckle was a brilliant marketer, and he decided to buy a Jabez Burns roaster, roast the coffee beans, and he would put these in these little paper bags and sell them, pre-roasted, and he became a millionaire.
Arbuckle's became known as the coffee that won the West. They set up depots to supply the wagon trains. Wherever the settlers went, coffee went with them. Sometimes in a pre-roasted form. Arbuckle's Ariosa was the first national brand of roasted coffee in a package, but others came.
Gold! Gold from the American River! Gold!
The gold rush attracts people from all over North America looking to make their fortune. One is a young man named Jim Folger, who comes from a famous whaling family.
The Folgers were so famous that Herman Melville mentioned them when he wrote Moby Dick. They lived in Nantucket, but by the 1840s, the sperm whales were pretty much hunted out. So the young Folger boys, teenagers, were allowed by their parents to take ship to the boom town of San Francisco to try to find gold.
When they got to California, there wasn't enough money for all three of them to go up into the mining areas, and so James stayed behind, and he was eventually hired as a carpenter for Mr. William Bovee, who was going to start a coffee and spice mill in San Francisco.
Boy, would it be to taste real coffee again. Maybe an egg or two.
If you had a fresh egg to sell on the trail, you could get $10 for an egg. What do you figure you could get for a pound of coffee?
At that time, most of the people in the gold fields were men, and they didn't have all of the equipment necessary to actually roast the coffee and grind it with them. And so James Folger realized that if they could roast the coffee and grind the coffee and take it up to the gold fields already roasted and ground, it would be better for the miners. And they immediately fell in love with this product.
And Folger eventually took over the entire business and decided that he could make his fortune not from gold, but from coffee.
In the late 1800s, Folger isn't the only businessman seeking his fortune in coffee. As per capita consumption reaches 10 pounds a year, branded coffee proliferates, and the roasting dynasties begin to take shape.
Joel Cheek was a great coffee merchant. His firm, Cheek Neal Coffee Company in Nashville, was just a wonderful, wonderful roaster. And he served the great Nashville hotel, the Maxwell House. The President of the United States visited that hotel and tried the coffee and looked at it, drank it down, turned the cup upside down and said, "Bully, it's good to the last drop." It made his fortune.
Another very famous coffee brand that started in the Boston area was two men named Caleb Chase and James Sanborn. And they began to put out Chase and Sanborn coffee. And again, they were brilliant advertisers. They sold a Mocha Java brand. The fact that it had very little coffee that came from Java or Mocha didn't make any difference to anybody back then. And the fact that they had to pre-stale the coffee before they sealed it into something, or it would have blown up, didn't seem to make any difference to anybody, and they did very well.
With the family business prospering, James Sanborn takes his daughter Helen on a coffee tour of Guatemala. She keeps a diary about the conditions she sees. We have never seen a dirty Indian, and seldom a ragged one. The women sorting the coffee cherries work very fast, but they are paid only 6 cents a day. The people regard them as little better than animals, addressing them as chucho, a word used to call a dog. The way coffee is grown determines the social structure of many Latin American countries, setting patterns maintained to this day. In Guatemala, like Brazil, coffee cultivation leads to the rapid growth of plantations owned by the wealthy elite. And the government, run by these coffee barons, assures a steady supply of Indian workers.
The meaning of coffee to the Indians 100 years ago was just a way of forcing them to work. When coffee came up here in the 1830s, 1840s, Guatemala suddenly had an export crop. It suddenly had something they could make money on, which for, 400 years they had not had.
Originally, this was just jungle, and when coffee was first introduced to this area, the farms were really hacked out of the jungle. My grandfather, Bernardo Hanstein, came from Germany in 1892. He found himself a lovely German lady who was my grandmother, and they then made their living on the south coast near the Mexican border on a coffee farm. People were brought down from the highlands with the owners of new lands that were being opened up, and they stayed.
The Guatemalan government instituted forced labor in order to make sure that they got the work done, because the population had no desire to go work on farms. The Indians did not get developed this way, but the society was able to become more part of a European cosmopolitan world by virtue of producing enough income from coffee. Coffee has a history of being produced in societies that have been very oppressive. It was part of an entire world of commodity production so that an American could drink a cup of coffee fairly cheaply because the labor here was so cheap. The question is a much bigger one than just why did coffee produce poverty by its production? And the problem since the colonies have broken up is these independent countries are gradually trying to pull themselves out of this inheritance of cheap production for the industrial world.
Coffee-producing nations, still struggling to free themselves of their colonial legacy, are soon at the mercy of a new master, the wildly gyrating market.
In 1880, that was the beginning of what's now called the boom-bust cycle. There would be too much coffee, the price would go down, people would then beware and stop growing so much, the price would go up, and then it would start all over again. Well, by 1900, the Brazilians were growing way, way too much coffee. And the price was so low that there was going to be a revolt.
Brazil adopts a radical strategy, withholding part of the coffee harvest in hopes of boosting the world price. But the plan backfires. Because profits are guaranteed, farmers rush to produce even more. Before long, Brazil is buried in unsold beans.
Because there was too much coffee, and because the market was artificially elevated in 1929, the coffee market crashed just a few weeks before the stock market crashed. In fact, that was one of the causes of the stock market crash. And then we entered this prolonged Great Depression.
Panic set in on the floor of the stock exchanges as the slump in prices wiped out the savings of countless Americans.
The Great Depression quickly spreads. In Brazil, plunging coffee prices topple the government, and coffee elites install a new strongman. But unlike other Latin American dictators, Getulio Vargas rules with moderation. Faced with ruinous prices, he orders a drastic solution: burn the coffee.
Just around the corner, there's a rainbow in the sky. So let's have another cup of coffee, and let's have another piece of pie.
Vargas fails to raise the price of coffee. And in the U.S., times are tough, too. Consumers can still get a cup for a nickel. But during the Depression, small roasters are no match for big business. Most of the old labels are taken over, and fresh roasts give way to stale, inferior blends in a can.
Everywhere above the Mason-Dixon line, canned coffee became, or cans became, the way that coffee was sold in the grocery stores. Along the way, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Company began to invent what we now call the supermarket. And the supermarket gave you a delivery system. And it was extremely expensive to do this, so only the largest brands could succeed. And slowly but surely, the remnant of the little mom-and-pop store that roasted coffee and sold coffee out of sacks and barrels disappeared.
Even the oldest family-run businesses, like Folgers, are being absorbed in corporate buyouts.
I can remember on Saturday mornings, I was probably 10 or 11 years old, I got to work with Dad, because we worked, of course, on a 5.5-day week, and I'd go down Saturday mornings with him, and I got to load cans onto a belt from the back end of the truck. The Kansas City branch of the Folger Coffee Company was a family affair. My grandfather first, then Dad, when he passed on, Dad took over as head of the company then. My Uncle Joe and my Uncle Frank were all in the business. Dad had retired. He didn't feel there was anybody really ready to take over that big a management jump. We got Procter & Gamble stock in exchange for Folger stock, and they took the control. So we merged into their operation. Sounds better than a sale. I don't drink Folgers anymore, although I'm sure the gourmet would be fine. To get fresh coffee that I like, I'm roasting my own coffee, buying green coffee that I know from experience is good, and roasting my own, grinding it, and roasting it every other day, so I always have fresh coffee. Good to have fresh coffee to wake up with.
Yes. Cotton beans, soybeans, how have you been? String beans, I'm not keen for a bean, unless it is the cheery coffee bean. I love coffee, I love tea, I love the jabba jive and it loves me. Coffee and tea and the jiving and me. A cup, a cup, a cup, a cup, a cup.
During World War II, because it was very difficult to brew coffee while you were in a trench, instant coffee became quite popular.
We wanted to get something to the troops in the trenches in Europe where it was cold and it was dank and it was horrible living conditions that would both keep them alert and help them keep warm.
The military depends upon it because military actions have to go on around the clock, and lives depend on them, people being alert and sharp. The best agent they found to produce alertness and improve performance is caffeine.
Tea's all right in its place, I guess. But in the Navy, you will learn to make and enjoy a good cup of coffee. We call it Joe. It'll be your friend throughout many a cold watch, and it's also a way to say welcome aboard to your shipmate.
Draw one, waiter, waiter, percolator, I love coffee, I love tea.
During World War II, the United States was willing to take part in some kind of coffee control scheme because they were afraid that Latin America was going to go Nazi.
In 1940, Brazilians found that the collapse of the European coffee markets had almost wrecked an industry which had been in distress since 1930. U.S. diplomats realized with alarm that if Brazil's economy were allowed to break down, the friendly government of Getulio Vargas might not long survive. To meet the crisis, the U.S. government underwrote the entire unshipped balance of Brazil's coffee crop for 1941, 42, and 43. Time marches on.
After the war, the coffee corporations bring instant coffee out of the trenches and into the kitchens.
The amazing coffee discovery. You know,
Any resemblance to real coffee is purely coincidental. But instant refined crystals made from cheap brewed coffee go well with the post-war rage for everything modern.
The instant coffee that they were making, that Maxwell House and Nestle was making, it was such bad quality that it didn't matter whether you used good beans or not. They would be ruined in the process, so why pay the money for good beans?
Maxwell House coffee sale. Save money and enjoy the coffee.
The big roasters got into these price wars with each other, and they would cheapen the blend to offer the cheapest possible canned coffee in the store. They would put more and more of the Robusta beans, the cheaper beans, into the blend. And as a result, what was happening was people were drinking less and less coffee. They were literally drinking less cups, but in the cups they were making more and more dilute coffee because it tasted so bad.
While Americans are drinking worse and worse blends, Canadians are dunking their donuts in a finer brew. Hockey great Tim Horton stick handles his way from pucks to donuts, and good coffee to wash them down.
The early marriage of the coffee and donut was an important one. Canadians' love of donuts. We're the biggest donut consuming nation per capita in the world. Two loves of Canadians, good coffee and a good donut at the same time under one roof. Tim Hortons is a quintessential Canadian coffee story, and the Canadian response has been pretty dramatic.
In Quebec, a new French immigrant is missing the fine coffee back home. Pawning his wife's diamond earrings, Albert Louis Van Hoot buys a Jabez Burns roaster and begins roasting beans in the back of his gourmet store.
Well, I was very young, but still I could remember I was going to the store on Ontario Street there, and I remember that it was smelling different, you see, from the street. When you get in the store, it was really a good perfume of coffee. My father wanted to have very good coffee, the bon mélange. It's an art to make a good coffee. If you think you can put coffee in the roaster, and no, you have to follow the processes of doing a good coffee. Otherwise, you cannot make a good coffee.
What Americans are buying isn't good coffee, but a mass-marketed commodity, a hot brown liquid to recharge the batteries. Rather than improving quality, the big roasters try to sell more through advertising.
It's ironic that one of the most famous and one of the most really lilting and wonderful television ads for coffee is the Maxwell House percolator theme, and it's celebrating a pretty bad way to make coffee, because the percolators, especially in the 50s when this ad came out, would, you know, recirculate the coffee and get it more and more bitter. But, you know, everybody knows this theme. I think it goes bum 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 bum. And, you know, it's a very happy little ting.
Pour a cup of this good-smelling coffee. It will taste as good as it's...
Folgers is the proud owner of the best and longest-lasting advertising campaign in the United States.
Honey, your coffee's miserable. Honey, you won't be able to give your coffee away.
Ned, really? I just can't make good coffee.
Mrs. Olson would help solve that problem by helping explain how mountain-grown Folgers would be a much better product and help satisfy everybody drinking it.
Ever try Folgers? Folgers coffee? Yeah. Is there some trick to it?
Folgers is mountain grown.
Mountain grown?
That's the richest kind.
When Mrs. Olson first came out, we all kind of laughed because she always wore an apron, and none of us wore aprons, even though that was kind of the housewifely thing to do.
Right. Hey, what happened to your coffee, sweetheart? Sweetheart, this coffee's great.
Now that's what I call coffee.
Coffee is only getting better in TV land, while on the streets, consumers continue to drink less. Corporate roasters now attempt to get them to drink more by introducing new products, like Sanka, coffee sans caffeine. Without caffeine, consumers can drink as much bad coffee as they please.
Okay, Cookie, what are you peddling now? Hey, a broken duck. Yeah, well, get it out of here. Thanks, Sergeant. Could I have some coffee?
You have to know yourself when you're using any drug, any substance.
This is my last warning, Sergeant. Tell your men to stop harassing my client.
You take too much, you're going to feel funny.
So you relax with that pot of ground Sanka coffee.
Where'd you find him?
At the zoo, swimming with the seals.
You got anything to say for yourself?
Okay. It gets you through the day.
For many, it's still regular coffee that gets them through the night. In their local 24-hour diner, over their bottomless 10-cent cup.
I'm feeling mighty lonesome, haven't slept a wink.
But in the mid-50s, the days of the 10-cent cup are numbered.
In between I drink black coffee.
When Brazil is hit by bad weather, a scarcity of coffee pushes the market price up for the first time in decades.
Everybody's always looking at the weather in Brazil to see, is there going to be a drought or is there going to be a freeze? Those are the two things everybody elsewhere in the world prays for, and some people in Brazil pray for, because it boosts the price of coffee. So in 1950 and in 1954, that happened. The price spiked very quickly.
Monday, August 27th, 1956, coffee increased another 3 cents a pound wholesale. I don't know how much it went up retail, but it probably went up. Among them were Chase and Sanborn, Manning's, Maxwell House, MJB, I mentioned then Folgers, were expected to follow suit. In most cases, the increase in the price of green coffee from South America has given the reason for the hike. Well, that's true, it had gone up.
I can't think that if the price of corn went up substantially that we would have congressional hearings. But that's because corn is grown in the United States. But when the price of coffee spikes, we have congressional hearings. This happened in 1950, 1954, 1977. At the 1950 hearings, a guy named Andres Uribe from Colombia testified before Congress, and it's a remarkable speech that he gave, and it's still true today, where he basically said, look, when you're talking about coffee, you're not just talking about a simple commodity. You're talking about the lives of millions of people.
Uribe continues his testimony. We in Latin America have a task before us which is staggering. Illiteracy to be eliminated, disease to be wiped out, a sound program of nutrition to be worked out for millions of people. If we could secure a fair price, we could work a miracle. If not, then you cast these millions to drift in a sea of poverty.
It's the coffee that goes with happy times. The richest coffee flavor known is Folgers flavor. Folgers flavor.
No one pays much attention to Uribe. Consumers know little about the problems of producers in the South, and the big roasters have no trouble ignoring the situation.
Mountain grown.
Caught up in Cold War paranoia, Americans dismiss the speech as one more example of communist subversion. Bus fares can go up without fanfare, but coffee is another matter. At the urging of the roasters, U.S. politicians let Latin America know that the way to make more money from their coffee is simply to sell more.
I would walk in the darkness before you came along.
The 50s was a particular time, and countries like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico organized a system of cooperation, and Colombia was one of the leaders, and we opened an office in New York, and they discovered that the coffee consumer didn't know anything about coffee. Where does it come from? How is it grown? Who does it? That's why we created in Colombia the image of Juan Valdez, the name of the typical coffee grower that used to come with his mule and the 2 bags of coffee.
One day in Colombia, South America, Juan Valdez took his coffee to market. He had grown the beans in rich mountain soil. He had shaded them so they would ripen slowly. In the market were 2 American coffee buyers. They bought for brands that used only Colombian beans.
6 months after this campaign started, coffee consumption went up. There was a contact, an awareness with the coffee grower.
This pleased Juan.
At that time, a Pan-American Bureau to promote coffee was created with the contribution of the United States and Canada and the coffee-producing countries of the area. The coffee break was originated there.
The Pan American Coffee Bureau launches a media campaign and introduces the term coffee break into the North American vocabulary.
Time out for a coffee break.
Would you like a better cup of coffee for your coffee break?
The coffee break is a deliberate attempt to increase consumption, but the strategy does not reduce the oversupply of coffee. In Brazil, once again, the glut causes prices to collapse amidst cries for President Vargas's impeachment. Vargas responds in an open letter to the nation. After decades of domination by international economic groups, I put myself at the head of a revolution and won. Then came the coffee crisis, and the value of our main product rose. We tried to defend the higher coffee price, but the response was so violent we were forced to give in. I have nothing more to give you now, except my blood. Putting down his pen, Brazil's longtime dictator shoots himself through the heart. Vargas's suicide undermines the already fragile social order in Latin America, leading to a period of Cold War instability.
A communist-influenced government ruled Guatemala from 1945 until this summer, when exiled Guatemalans came back with guns. This was revolution. The anti-communist rebels invaded from neighboring Honduras.
In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz's land reforms are affecting the privileges of the coffee elite and foreign enterprises. Fearing a communist takeover, the CIA sponsors an invasion. It's a disaster for the country. The new president annuls the reforms, and years of oppression and bloodshed follow.
2,000 miles away, the United Nations met in extraordinary Sunday session. Russian delegate Sieuthicafe got Lodge's blunt warning.
Representative of the Soviet Union, stay out of this hemisphere. And don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
Despite the U.S. warning, Cold War tensions only escalate. From the coffee fields of Latin America to the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, the U.S. engages in an anti-communist campaign culminating in the Vietnam War. Faced with a threatening adversary, the U.S. is prepared to make a new alliance.
In 1962, finally the United States entered what was known as the International Coffee Agreement. They weren't afraid of Nazis anymore, but they were afraid of communists. They felt that if the price of coffee went too low, there would be revolution all throughout Latin America. So they were willing to enter this sort of OPEC agreement for coffee called the ICA, the International Coffee Agreement.
The coffee agreement was the result of a political agreement adopted at the highest level to create better trade conditions for the commodities that were produced by more than 50 or 60 developing countries around the world. And there were different approaches. For coffee, it was the quota system.
Under the quota system, producing countries agree to limit the amount of coffee they export, and consuming countries agree to limit what they import. Despite constant battles over quotas, the system works. Coffee growers enjoy the longest period of relative stability they have ever known. But like most price control schemes, the agreement is subject to political and economic pressures.
Nobody was ever very happy with this agreement. It involved all the consuming countries, well, except Russia never joined it. And it involved all of the producing countries, all of whom were jealous of each other. There was a constant fight as to what the quota should be. In 1989, the whole thing fell apart. Brazil wanted to back out of it for various reasons. The U.S. wanted to back out of it because the Cold War was ending. Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. There was all this coffee in reserve, and everybody rushed to dump it onto the world market before the price went too low. And of course what that did was to drive the price ever lower. So the bottom dropped out of the market for years, below the cost of production.
The world's coffee giant is not about to take the low prices lying down. To Brazil's coffee industry, this means war.
Eu termino sempre com a frase do general de guerra chinês Sun Tzu, que dizia que na paz, prepare-se para a guerra, e na guerra, prepare-se para a paz. E eu termino dando um enfoque, o que isso representa dentro do mercado de uma commodity como o café. O produtor, durante os preços baixos, ele tem que se preparar para os preços altos. E durante os preços altos, ele tem que se preparar para os preços baixos. Que esses ciclos são inevitáveis.
Brazil prepares for the next bust in the cycle with a huge investment in farming technology. Massive new machines replace human labor, so producers make a profit even when prices drop fairly low.
A Ipanema preocupa com a mecanização do café. A Ipanema tem 11 milhões de pés de café e a produção para o ano que vem está estimada em 125 mil sacas. Mais de 50% do seu café mecanicamente, implementando quando elas são de bom proveito para a empresa.
A partir daí, novas tecnologias, ela veio para viabilizar grandes empresas investindo no plantio de café. Agora, em termos de qualidade, o produtor brasileiro ainda deixa a desejar.
As the quality of Brazil's industrial crop is dropping, the multinational corporations are getting their coffee cheap. They are the winners when Brazil's production hits a record 50 million bags. But the real corporate windfall comes when a war-weary, tea-drinking nation bursts onto the coffee market. In just a decade, Vietnam's production swells by over 1,000%.
Vietnam became the second largest coffee producing country in the world. And the coffee they're producing is primarily Robusta, which is a low quality coffee in the first place, but it's also, they're producing bad Robusta. Well, what's happened is they've flooded the world with bad coffee, and that's the real reason for this coffee crisis. Now, Brazil is also growing way too much Robusta. It's not just Vietnam. But there's no question that this is all tied in together. You say the word Vietnam to a coffee grower in Guatemala, and they will, make the sign of the cross and spit at you because, they blame the Vietnamese for the current coffee crisis and for the fact that they can't make a living.
After a century of boom and bust, the world's worst commodity downturn becomes a full-blown global crisis. The effects are nowhere greater than in the coffee-growing regions of Central America. Here, entire communities are dislocated, and families have little access to the basic necessities of life.
Pues lo que es la crisis de café es una pobreza que existe entre la familia, entre ambos, pues esposo y hijos, porque sabemos que de la crisis del café sufren los niños, lo de que es la salud, lo que es el vestuario y el estudio.
Nosotros los pobres de Guatemala ya no podemos conseguir trabajo porque del café vivíamos, porque no hay trabajo aquí, tenemos que emigrar, unos al departamento, otros a la capital, otros intentando a Estados Unidos, donde lamentablemente algunos logran sus objetivos y otros encuentran la muerte.
Él es Jesús López Ramos, él es originario del estado de Jalisco y el estado de...
The crisis captures the world's attention when 14 Mexican coffee farmers, searching for a way to feed their families, die crossing the Arizona desert.
Yo para mí, mi hermano mayor era lo máximo, porque siempre se enfermaba mi papá y mi mamá y siempre corría yo con él por ser el mayor.
At the turn of the 21st century, many of the people who produce our coffee are only marginally better off than their enslaved ancestors. The wild cycles that led to the latest crisis will certainly continue until governments and the big coffee corporations help end the chaos in the coffee market. Even at the best of times, it would cost most coffee farmers a full day's wages to buy the frothy cappuccino consumers enjoy daily in their local coffee house. But ironically, it is this new generation of coffee lovers who could be Latin America's